its members. In this first installment, we will look at this group's ambitions for healthcare and biotechnology. Many Trump voters this cycle embraced the quote unquote Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA movement, which initially supported a rejection of the experimental biotech products rolled out during the COVID era, as well as a desire to extricate government healthcare regulation from the pharmaceutical industry. While it appears that MAHA's de facto champion, Robert F. Kennedy, is slated to become of HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, the department is poised to approve a slate of experimental products via deregulation, to introduce biosurveillance regimes that would result in mass biodata mining, and to expand Palantir's already massive and invasive contracts with HHS. Joining me to discuss this and more is Max Jones, who has written and co-written several recent Unlimited Hangout investigations covering these very topics. In addition to contributing to Unlimited Hangout, Max is the producer for Chris Hedges' The Chris Hedges Report, and a staff writer and video producer for Sheer Post. Thanks for joining me today, Max, and welcome to Unlimited Hangout.
Thanks for having me, Whitney.
Well, it is my pleasure. And I guess we could start off this discussion talking about the MAHA movement itself, how it was an important part of getting Trump elected, at least, that's the perception anyway, and how a lot of the initially stated goals that injected a lot of energy into that movement have gradually been moved, largely since the Kennedy endorsement of Trump several months ago. So as I noted earlier, a lot of the initial focus of MAHA was around taking big pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, out of government healthcare regulation, ending the so-called revolving door, which was a big focus of Robert F. Kennedy's campaign and some of his work prior, and definitely something he voiced extensively on his podcast. And also a rejection of COVID-era policies, that including the military-run Operation Warp Speed, initially launched during the first Trump administration, and also the experimental biotech products, namely the mRNA vaccines that were produced downstream of Operation Warp Speed, and became, obviously a source of great controversy for a lot of people in this particular movement. But it seems like a lot of the MAHA ambitions, at least if you're following what the influencers in this movement are saying, seems to have changed. Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah, definitely. Because it's actually interesting, because I think that there's been this characterization of RFK Jr. on the liberal side of the spectrum as being like this insane right-wing nut job, even though he's a right-wing Democrat. And then there's this I guess a lot of people on the right, or conservatives, that were skeptical of COVID-era policy really were drawn to him because of his critiques that I think he made in the book that he wrote, which were all very, a lot of it which was very valid. And when you look at RFK's actual initial agenda that was then associated with Make America Healthy Again, it was built on this kind of like liberal promise to use regulatory power to curb the influence of big pharma and big food. And, some of the things that, and in a pretty moderate way, I think that, like, in previous election cycles, if it was coming from a more traditional, like, Democratic Party figure that wasn't associated with conservatives via COVID, I'm guessing most liberals would probably support. Like, one of the things that he wanted to do, aside from the increasing regulations and making the clinical trials for vaccines more rigorous, were things like stopping advertising on TV from big pharma, which is something that's like pretty widely accepted among the Democratic Party constituency, I believe. But partisan politics kind of brain rots everything. So there's this weird distortion with RFK, and so while RFK's initial agenda was built on this kind of promise to use regulatory power to curb the influence of these industries, there's been this shift, and that kind of grew out of, as we note in the article, out of the shuttering of his campaign and his association with Trump. And RFK's endorsement of Trump, in my opinion, was pretty important, because the Trump campaign, I think, realized this time around that the populist element of Trump was what was going to give them the victory against the Democrats, which were very much associated with the establishment. And RFK kind of granted them this tinge of populism through his association with Trump. And now we see I mean, just like recently with these hearings, RFK is starting to really back away from these initial promises to use regulatory power to do things like increase the rigorousness of clinical trials on vaccines and re-examining the childhood vaccine mandate. And like just one tidbit that I saw in the New York Times the other day that like shows this. So in order to move forward in his confirmation to lead HHS, RFK secured the endorsement of Senator Bill Cassidy, and Cassidy has obvious ties to big pharma and vaccine development. Like so, and by the way that he secured this endorsement, according to the Times, was by extracting a series of commitments from Kennedy. Cassidy did, and Cassidy's largest donors are from pharma and healthcare companies. Like his second largest contributor was actually from Oceaner Health System. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but it's spelled OCHSNER. And they actually, during the pandemic, increased insurance costs for their employees with unvaccinated spouses during the pandemic. And RFK allegedly promised this guy Cassidy that he was going to give Congress advance notice of any changes he might make in vaccine policy. So that, among other comments that RFK made, which you can describe for the audience, really show RFK shifting away from this initial agenda that I think really helped Trump cultivate a lot of those COVID era dissidents, despite being the government that actually initiated a lot of this policy, like Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, so I think, obviously there are the devil's advocates out there that say, well, of course RFK had to say these things in front of the Senate, otherwise he can't be confirmed. But sort of that wishy-washiness as a means of obtaining political power, it opens up enough doubt that you can't really know if that's true or not. And if he's expressing, the viewpoints he expressed there to the Senate, it's certainly possible that he plans to implement those policies stated there. Obviously, he'd experience a lot more resistance if he were to pursue stuff he said, back when he was on the campaign trail, for example. But again, it remains to be seen, I think, to an extent with RFK as HHS secretary, but I think there have been some revealing statements even before, and reports even before his confirmation hearing. So one of these was a Wall Street Journal article that's from January 14th, so almost a month ago, and it's entitled "Trump Team Sidelines RFK Jr.'s Anti-Vaccine Aides." And essentially that article, citing people close to both Trump and Kennedy, says that Kennedy was sort of dumping a lot of his people close to him that were expected to serve as aides if he were appointed to HHS, that he had affiliations with from Children's Health Defense, from example, in favor of, it seems like he didn't really pick his staff, actually. So one of these would be that his chief of staff is Heather Flick, who was picked by Trump, who was previously involved with Alex Azar's HHS, which was Trump's first term. And, was the HHS that first declared COVID a health emergency and oversaw a lot of the creation and implementation of Operation Warp Speed before Biden came into office. And so there is a section in this article that basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially said something to the effect that he was going to not pursue changes to vaccine policy, because and instead was going to focus on women's food and exercise. And it's interesting that that report came out when it did, because in the months prior to that, sort of these several influential figures sort of seemed to come out of nowhere after the Kennedy endorsement of Trump, namely the Means siblings, Callie and Casey Means, and started promoting a lot of the stuff about sort of blaming the chronic disease epidemic, as it's been referred to, in which I agree with the nomenclature there, as being, pretty much entirely due to big food, but only specific aspects of things in big food. I don't think biotech, GMOs in the food supply have been really addressed meaningfully by the Means siblings, that sort of focus on the healthy standard American diet, and sort of this promotion of things like beef tallow, among other things, which is fine. I'm certainly not criticizing those claims, but I think it's sort of an effort to engineer a more myopic stance for Maha so that it's easier to secure those quote unquote wins for the movement and sort of act like campaign promises to that coalition were fulfilled, while avoiding the ones that involve removing industry influence from HHS and the FDA, for example, and anything that would have to do with sort of taking mRNA products off the market or making it more difficult to get on the market.
Right. And another thing that I found interesting in the article was that they described Flick, according to a former FDA official, so I don't know exactly how accurate this claim is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's true. And it seems to fit based on the money and interest in the that are associated with the Trump administration, that Flick is acting as the sort of, this is what they say, sort of Trump guy's eyes and ears within the department too. She's a very important liaison and information source. The chief of staff, they kind of lay down the law. So, like, that implies that there's this effort from within the Trump camp to basically subvert Kennedy's more radical agenda, I guess you could say. And
it sounds like a babysitter.
Yeah, exactly. And that makes, that might be surprising to a lot of people that are follow these like MAGA influencers that kind of just don't really cover this stuff. But when you look at the people that are actually very heavily affiliated with Trump, it's not that surprising. Like, for example, the most obvious one is probably like Peter Thiel, who is pretty much entirely responsible for the rise of J.D. Vance's entire political career, and also started his private sector career in venture capital. And I mean, Peter Thiel is founder and currently the largest shareholder of Palantir, and Palantir right now has a contract with the has multiple contracts with the HHS and the CDC, which is a sub-agency of the HHS, to basically build up this entire biosurveillance infrastructure across the country to basically data from the local level to the federal level, a steady stream of bio data to constantly develop pandemic and disease outbreak forecasts, to then allow the CDC to correspondingly provide curated policy for communities based on their outbreak potential or outbreak status or whatever. And so obviously, like something like that is very heavily associated with these mRNA, the procurement of mRNA and biotechnology products. As we saw during COVID-19, like you reported, I think initially in the Last American Vagabond, about how Google and Oracle were, according to, I think, one of the Operation Warp Speed heads, I don't know if this was actually, like if the contracts were ever officially...
Monsef Salawi, who was the head of Operation Warp Speed, said it, that Google and Oracle had received contracts to follow recipients of the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines for up to 2 years.
Yeah. So surveillance is part and parcel to emergency procurement, development, and distribution of biotechnology products. So, like, right there, you have a clear example of one of the key guys associated with Trump that make huge investments in this industry existing in the first place. So when you take note of that, it actually makes this whole effort to subvert Kennedy and this incentive from Kennedy in order to secure the position to like basically distance himself from his initial policy agenda. It actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, I think there's the potential also to do some sort of dynamic, some good cop, bad cop dynamic, at least in terms of public perception with HHS policy going forward. Considering, as we covered recently, the appointment to be the deputy to RFK, deputy HHS secretary being Jim O'Neill, who's a longtime Peter Thiel associate, used to run the Thiel Foundation, co-founded the Thiel Fellowship with Peter Thiel, worked at Mithril Capital and also Clarion Capital, which is now Thiel Capital. And obviously at Mithril, he was J.D. Vance's boss, I guess, where, significant investments in biotech and also in Palantir were made. So Jim O'Neill, and as you can read our article on this for all the nitty-gritty details, he essentially has been arguing for quite some time for the ending of efficacy testing of products at, I guess, the FDA specifically. He was actually floated to be FDA head under the first Trump administration and was considered too controversial for that role. I can't remember if Balaji Srinivasan, who's the Andreessen Horowitz partner, created the network state idea. he was also pitched to be head of FDA, but was also deemed too controversial, and they settled, I guess, on Scott Gottlieb, who became kind of infamous during the COVID era for his revolving door relationship with Pfizer, and also this CIA-linked company that's now doing all the biomanufacturing for this, a lot of the mRNA vaccines. It's called Resilience. I think previously was called National Resilience, that I reported on some a few years ago. But essentially, Jim O'Neill, by eliminating efficacy tests, would facilitate a lot of these products getting on the market because, as a lot of my past reporting and reporting of others has noted about these mRNA products and what was even known about them before the COVID-19 event. Basically, you can either make them safe but not effective, or toxic and effective. It's kind of like this slider where you either get one or the other, and that makes it, of course, very difficult for them to get through the existing regulatory paradigm at the FDA. And as we noted just a minute ago, a lot of what was the initial ambition, at least publicly expressed, of this MAHA movement was about more stringent clinical testing for these types of experimental products. Because, of course, a lot of the controversy around what happened during COVID-19 is that, the emergency deregulatory paradigm was used to force this experimental biotech onto the market and onto the public, and basically the people that took it became guinea pigs. And this is when you consider that for 10 years, Moderna and Pfizer's BioNTech, they couldn't get anything on the market because they couldn't even get through animal trials. All of a sudden they can get on the market and they're...
Well, yeah, like Moderna, as you reported in your Moderna in need of a Hail Mary series, basically overcome a lot of the same problems that we note in our article as the companies that O'Neill invests in via Mithril, and also I think personally as well. Like they can't even get through, or even get to clinical trials sometimes because of these problems, right? And like some of these companies that he's worked for have existed for like over a decade, and they have no products brought to market, just like Moderna before the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were yeah.
And so some of these companies have been around for like 15 years or longer in some cases, and haven't been able to get anything on the market. So obviously, the only way to get it on the market thus far has been to, use COVID-19 vaccines because of, the emergency use authorization. I would technically call it a loophole in this case, but it's really the only way that it's been able to go on the market. Obviously, it seems like the testing for livestock, there's been a lot of talk about mRNA products already being at the livestock. I guess there are cases where it does get through animal trials for animal vaccines, but I have a feeling that animal vaccine testing is a lot less stringent than it is for humans. And I don't know. Well, I'm kind of, I think it's interesting, this whole ending efficacy testing paradigm, because of course it's being framed as a way to remove needless regulation and bureaucratic red tape, and to make way for free market innovation. And these are, kind of the standard Republican talking points here. But obviously, what happened during COVID-19 was a removal, technically, right, of that bureaucratic red tape. And it sort of unleashed the very corrupt pharmaceutical industry, or wing of it rather, in biotech, to have no liability for these experimental products and have them used massively and to reap massive profits from them. And of course, now that's been pitched as the U.S. government would share in those profits. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, in the press conference announcing the creation of a new U.S. sovereign wealth fund, commented at how the U.S. would begin buying equity in these types of vaccine companies, so that when COVID-19 vaccines, for example, are sold abroad, the U.S. government has a direct financial incentive, which is pretty telling, I think, of where this administration plans to go with mRNA. And I think also some of the controversial statements made by Oracle's Larry Ellison at the Stargate press conference on Trump's first day in the White House about this new era of AI-powered, personalized mRNA vaccines for cancer. A lot of these mRNA companies that got, sort of looked at by independent media during COVID, a lot of them have been focusing on cancer specifically for a long time, because you can basically charge more because you're making a personalized vaccine for each person. There's been a push for this. It was arguably one of the reasons that Biden created the ARPA-H, the Health DARPA agency, which he framed as a cancer moonshot. A lot of it was framed around this very same idea that is being promoted on day one of the Trump White House, which is quite telling.
And importantly, ARPA-H was, as you noted in your investigation, was initially pitched to the Trump administration as a pre-crime tool. And I don't think that there was any transition to a predictive health program. It wasn't like they changed the data sources that they would be tapping under this program for pre-health purposes versus
even the architect. I mean, the main guy behind it is this guy named Bob Wright, who was the top executive at NBC Universal, and he's a good friend of Trump because that is the network that brought you the Apprentice. But it was the main architect that was hired by Wright to design the program as an ex-DARPA guy named Jeffrey Ling, who was basically running a lot of the experimental biotech stuff at DARPA, because initially a lot of this mRNA technology came out of DARPA funding, a lot of it happening under the Obama administration, their DARPA. And since then, the director of DARPA when those initial investments in mRNA were made is Regina Dugan, and she has since become head of the Wellcome Trust's own DARPA equivalent called Welcome Leap, that I reported on a few years ago. So, it's notable, I think, that this is set to expand in the U.S. under the current administration, because a lot of the same entities that were vilified during COVID, and I think were rightly vilified personally, whether that's the Wellcome Trust or, Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, are all in on biotech and really see it as necessary to expand, their ambitions for global health and, the health-related sustainable development goals, which I've argued, in my work on the SDGs is really about creating new markets and using public policy to impose those markets on people, because there's no actual demand for the products of these markets that they're making. And that kind of, I think maybe kind of similar to what ends up happening here. It's ultimately, maybe the sales pitches are different, or the way it's being marketed is going to be different, under Trump. But ultimately, having this type of experimental biotechnology be all over the market and its use to be normalized, I think is definitely something that we can expect over the next 4 years, unfortunately. And I think another indicator of this, in addition to sort of these quote unquote babysitters that are actually going to be running the show for RFK, he's nominally the head, but Heather Flick, as chief of staff, decides who gets access to him, what his schedule is, what he does as HHS secretary, basically. And then Jim O'Neill being basically the person who manages day-to-day operations and oversees the FDA and all these sub-agencies on Kennedy's behalf. There is a lot of room to go against Kennedy, even if Kennedy was intent on challenging biotech as head of HHS. And as you noted earlier, it's not necessarily clear that is the case. But I don't want to come out and say it's not a possibility. But,
right.
I'm not very enthusiastic about the prospects at the moment, but I don't want to necessarily say I know for a fact what his plans are. But another figure that sort of points to this, in addition to the people at HHS, the Larry Ellison statements, the Lutnick statements, is the guy who's slated to be head of the FDA himself. So that's Martin Makary, who's a top guy at Johns Hopkins, I believe. And he became pretty popular recently. He was promoted a lot to Trump's face, I think, before he was announced to be FDA head, going on the Megyn Kelly show. I think he even has his own podcast, but he definitely was a frequent guest on a lot of podcast circuits, and, sort of talking about using a lot of the MAHA buzzwords about, chronic health epidemic and all of that, but it's his stance on biotech, I think, has sort of been overlooked by a lot of these influencers in the Make America Healthy Again movement. And I think that was pretty clearly portrayed, not just by the reporting on industry reactions to his appointment as charge of the FDA, but also the boost in stocks for biotech that McCarry's announcement um, elicited. So, of course, there have been reports saying every time like Kennedy's is um, advancing toward getting confirmed, there's a dip in vaccine stocks, but the opposite seems to be true for Marty Makary, who has been is considered very friendly to the biotech industry by the people that run that industry, to the so much to the point that some have said that they dodged a bullet with his appointment.
Mhm.
Which I think is notable. And as we noted in our article, his statements during COVID-19, he was very unhappy with it taking multiple weeks for the COVID-19 vaccines to be approved under the emergency use paradigm at the FDA. He argued it should have happened in less than 24 hours. So that sort of, combined with how biotech feels about him and that COVID stance under that particular deregulatory paradigm, it seems like he'd be pretty supportive of the vision that people like Jim O'Neill hold. And I don't think
Yeah.
I made it explicit earlier, and I probably should have, but Jim O'Neill's interest in eliminating efficacy tests isn't necessarily to eliminate all efficacy data collection. He thinks that data collection should take place after people take the drug and should be conducted via biosurveillance. And as we note in the article, there are a lot of people that he cites as sort of his I guess, mentors in a sense in developing this view, who argue that that should happen through a variety of means and have a variety of outcomes. I don't know if you'd be interested in speaking to that, Max.
Yeah, for sure. And just one other thing that I think will lead into this stuff about Richard Barker, who I think you're talking about, one of the people
Yeah.
that he mentions as being like, I mean, not, he doesn't say necessarily that it's like an inspiration, but he talks about how he really appreciates his work and thinks they're doing great stuff on this end of basically deregulation. And but O'Neill's interest, as he notes himself in that talk that where he said that notorious line, well, it was notorious, seems like no one cares anymore, at least in the mainstream media, about eliminating efficacy tests. He's actually been interested in this deregulatory paradigm since his time at HHS, I think, with Tommy Thompson and Mike Leavitt, where he was notably very close in proximity to the centers of power that developed this, and initially made a huge step, a significant step towards this deregulatory paradigm. And you talked about creating artificial, like basically manufacturing artificial demand for these markets that no one really wants. O'Neill was arguably, well, I don't want to comment on how crucial of a role he played, but he was certainly very close in proximity to the centers of power at the HHS that were crucial in getting the BARDA passed, the Project BioShield Act of 2004, which implemented or created the BARDA agency. And that then led to them purchasing all of these Tamiflu stockpiles, as you noted in the article, which kind of caused Gilead's stock prices to, I think, as you noted, quadruple, right? When it had dipped before.
Well, so BARDA basically functions as like an ATM for big pharma.
Yeah.
Any sort of threat, no matter how manufactured the threat is, and in the case of bird flu, it was mostly manufactured by people who are now very discredited post COVID-19, like Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College of London. A lot of his modeling was used to create these doomsday statistics about what a potential bird flu pandemic would be like, between 2004 and 2006.
Right.
And he was fresh off the controversy in Britain, where he helped use similar doomsday statistic modeling of dubious credibility as a part of the government response to a mad cow disease outbreak, which led to the unnecessary culling of an insane amount of livestock in Britain and very negatively impacted their farming industry. But basically, as we learned during COVID-19, it's very possible to manufacture fear using statistics and using quote-unquote experts in the absence of real clinical data showing the same. And by doing so, you create this threat, Congress can express outrage, or the media drums up concern, Congress responds, and BARDA ends up buying a bunch of stockpiles of medication, often billions of dollars worth, from pharmaceutical companies of things that will be used to respond to this doomsday event that doesn't exist yet. And that stockpile, was justified initially by the 2001 anthrax attacks needs. It was pushed for back as a policy response to that before Project BioShield was even introduced in Congress. This idea that there's going to be bioterror events. I mean, that was back, this is back in the War on Terror era, so that's initially how they sold it, but eventually, moved to the idea of sort of a zoonotic pandemic and needing to sort of stockpile. And so the stockpile since then has sort of been to address both of those threats. And has often been used, by companies to basically boost companies of dubious credibility, like Emergent Biosolutions, who created the anthrax vaccine that was never properly tested and does not work and has been linked to Gulf War syndrome, among other things, and was actually being given to military personnel and used in an off-label way to the point where they lost in court and had to stop giving it to people until, people like Jerome Hauer came in and saved the day. We can talk about Jerome Hauer another time, but if you're interested in learning more about him and weird things about him in 9/11, you can read my few years old series called Engineering Contagion about those attacks and how a lot of this came to be. But basically, the people that created that infrastructure were also the people that led early COVID response, like Robert Kadlec, for example, who was Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response under the first Trump administration. He helped author Project BioShield, develop the idea for BARDA. I was very close to the clique that I argue in my series actually committed the 2001 anthrax attacks. There's no way it was actually Bruce Ivins. Anyway, getting a little off topic, but basically, it was basically a way to create welfare for big pharma and to manufacture fear for the purpose of basically creating markets for products people don't need or want. And using fear to do so. And also at the same time, it's, a dual use in a way, because fear is also routinely used to take away people's civil liberties. So it's a way to get people to surrender bodily autonomy in one way, and also a way to get civil liberties, as many of them acts as possible for the benefit of the national security state. And I think, COVID-19, years after, BioShield was passed, was definitely quite revealing in that's how these things tend to work. So, Jim O'Neill's proximity to that, I think, is worth pointing out. And as you know in the article, he was the main speechwriter for Tommy Thompson and Leave It when a lot of this fear mongering about bird flu was going on, and when Project BioShield was being peddled to Congress. And he, notes in his own CV that he was very involved with pandemic response and writing speeches on pandemic influenza, which in this case refers to the bird flu speeches, and then subsequently went on to lead, various, not the same type of role he'll be having now as number 2, but definitely a top tier HHS executive level position later on. So he definitely had a lot of clout within the Bush administration's HHS, and it seems like a lot of that deregulatory vision that was, characteristic of the Bush era is likely to make a comeback, even with someone like RFK as the public face of the agency.
Yeah, and notably by his own, mission, like he was interested in this deregulation from the beginning, or from his entire beginning of his public sector career at least, and he was there helping this legislation, presumably helping this legislation get passed on the speechwriting teams of Tommy Thompson and Mike Leavitt. And he actually even bragged about in that same talk where he says that we need to eliminate efficacy tests, how he actually blocked the FDA from starting to regulate this one biotechnology. Anyway, yeah, and one thing that the mainstream media reports that talked talked about that a couple years ago, that speech that he gave where he advocated eliminating efficacy tests. They didn't mention was that he then goes on to praise the work of this guy named Richard Barker, who's the founding director of CASME. And his model of adaptive licensing. And I think that Barker's model is worth noting because I think it clues us into what O'Neill wants to do, and also this kind of biotech deregulatory / surveillance paradigm in general.
Really quick, I just want to note for the audience that CASME is housed at Oxford. I believe Barker is British, and the CASME, I believe, is the Center for Accelerating Sustainable Medical Innovation, if I'm not mistaken, which the name should tell you a lot if you're familiar with PR.
Right. So, like, something that Barker says is that there's this huge problem, I guess, in drug development, where basically is that those handling clinical development, in my opinion, at least in the way that I think drug development should work, the people that are, in theory, in the best form of capitalism or whatever, should not be concerned with the commercial interests of the drug they're creating, and instead should be concerned with, things like, does it work? Is it going to help save lives or treat people's sicknesses or whatever? He says that they actually need to, that they're separated from the commercial side, and that they actually need to be, that big pharma and the people that are more concerned with the profits of those drugs need to be infused into the drug development process further. And he says that that should be done via the collection of value data. He basically thinks that this should happen via the utilization and collection of a massive amount of real-world data, and that's data accumulated outside of clinical trial settings, like, through electronic health records, maybe your Apple Watch, your phone, wearables.
Yeah.
And again, like, this is important to note because regarding MAHA movement, because RFK Jr.'s agenda is like the exact, at least the agenda that he was, having the campaign that was like the exact opposite of what this guy Barker said. And, so like, here's a quote that from Barker himself. He says that they need to integrate value in the design of clinical development with the early crafting phase involving the input of regulators, payers, and patient associations, so as to ensure the collection of both clinical and value data. And he literally advocates this as being a way to solve the problem of drug makers having to set the initial market value of their drug as being very high, and instead allow companies to basically like test the value of their drug through these real world data sources, and then use that data to basically accrue or increase the value of the drug over time, aka basically just like jack up prices of drugs as they continue to exist on the market longer by using this what he calls value data, which, for anyone listening, would be accumulated from your devices and your labor, whatever, your existence, basically. So, like, Barker's literally advocating for big pharma to directly exploit data mined segments of people to cultivate capital and value for drug products, with them getting nothing in return. And then, he goes even further where he believes that patient populations should be segmented and surveilled to basically allow pharma to develop this outcome-focused way of creating drugs.
Do you think that could be used potentially for big pharma to like charge different prices for the same drug on different populations? So like if it's deemed to be more effective in one ethnic group than the other, they can charge that ethnic group more than they would charge another ethnic group. Like, is that a potential consequence of this segmented population idea?
Yeah, I would think so, because I talked to Nolan Higdon, this scholar from Stanford University, who wrote this book about surveillance implications. He basically studied data industry, this cloud capital industry, whatever you call it. And he basically said that every time that in his studies that he came across these promises, these altruistic promises, where Parker's probably thinking that people are going to hear this as, oh well, that's great. They get to use my data and then I get a better drug because it's developed for me or something, or my population, people like me. But I mean, he said that in pretty much every case that it's used to exploit the consumer and the worker and jack up prices and cut costs. And so yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that's a possibility or if that happens. I mean, one thing that he said was that it's very likely that this real-world data will also be used by insurance companies, for example, to charge higher premiums based on certain lifestyle habits that these wearables or your other devices might pick up on you. So he said, for example, like, oh, you're sleeping 5 hours a night, and that makes you X amount more likely to get this disease or this condition. Therefore, you're not taking care of yourself, so we can't really cover you because look at the subjective data that we have that shows that you're not taking care of yourself. Why would we cover you? So yeah, I definitely think that's possible.
Well, that's going to be fun for the private insurance companies. They're really going to like that.
Yeah.
They'll be spawning like an army of Luigi Mangionis, I guess.
Yeah, and if O'Neill, seeks to implement Barker's model, they'll even be more involved in the development process, right? And I'm sure that there's probably concerns that they may already be too involved in that to begin with, and maybe now they'll just be even more involved, which will be great for them. And in addition, Barker believes that we can have this outcome-focused form of healthcare, like we just mentioned. And basically, he says that we develop in volume currently. So, okay, we got to develop a bunch of this drug and then kind of like hope that people need it and take it. I think an example of that might be the Tamiflu stuff, right? They had this drug and it seemed like there wasn't so much demand for it. And then they needed to manufacture this artificial demand by instilling fear in the population and selling this pitch about bird flu, etc.
Yeah.
So basically, this predictive outcome-focused use of data would allow, quote, products to be prescribed and used by the right patient segment. And then he goes further and he says that we can also use this data where we segment patients to focus on behavioral factors. So they're also now, they don't just want to cultivate this data for health purposes or for drug development purposes. They also want to produce means of behavioral modification because he says that the industry needs to focus on the behavioral factors which drive adherence, either as accelerators or decelerators. So
that sounds so much like the COVID era.
Yeah.
Behavioral modification and nudging and all of that.
Right.
To stop vaccine hesitancy. But I guess now it'll be to stop biosurveillance hesitancy.
Yeah. And the thing that I think that MAHA voters, or everyone, but especially these people that may be optimistic about having RFK Jr. and some rhetoric about this stuff in the Trump administration, they should be very wary of comments like this because they're actively studying ways to incentivize to make you accept these products. And so he says the goal should be to collect evidence as to how to boost adherence. And the exercise is complex since there are many types of patients with different behavioral contexts and psychological barriers, which it highlights the breadth of data that they're planning to collect on this issue specifically. And I noted in the article that this concept of utilizing these mass data sets to basically manipulate human behavior and direct outcomes of populations is like straight out of the military playbook. I mean, Yasha Levine's book Surveillance Valley is basically about how the entire DARPA tech military apparatus was a counterinsurgency program from the very beginning, and you see that just being repurposed for different means. And And the fact that a lot of this data that they want to collect has dual use purposes. So, like, for example, the same data that they're collecting on you via your Apple Watch about your health could also presumably be used to predict if you're going to shoot up a school or whatever.
Yeah, because they'll just say it's mental health.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, that's the thing. Every time someone does something like that, that's
Hey, just wait till the Neuralink mandates to make sure everyone is, not secretly thinking about committing crimes before they happen. I say that as a joke, but
Larry Ellison has literally said that when we have this, like, these AI nodes all across the country that are constantly analyzing and getting fed this data that is collected via all these devices, that we're going to be a lot safer because no one's going to misbehave anymore, and right. So I mean, it's not that far-fetched to think something like that could happen or be pursued or in some capacity. And yeah, so I mean, I think that that's the gist on Richard Barker, and I think it really clues you into O'Neill's mindset on these things, and also, like, I just wanted to note too, because I mean, it appears that they've really banked on exploiting RFK Jr.'s kind of like anti-establishment bona fides to sell this stuff. Like, so for example, here's a tweet from Jim O'Neill, where he's advocating this outcome-focused version of drug development. He says, many Americans think we have free markets in healthcare. We don't. Hundreds of bureaucratic rules, perverse incentives, and opaque pricing make healthcare more expensive and less efficient than it should be. Providers of care are usually paid by volume, not outcomes. So he's advocating for outcomes. And then he says this, and to me, this is the co-opting of the RFK, Make America Healthy Again language. He says, and government makes chronic disease worse by subsidizing unhealthy food and offering poor nutritional advice to families who are trying their best to stay healthy. So right there, you have this deregulatory paradigm that conflicts directly with I would say, the most important parts of RFK Jr.'s initial agenda that was associated with the Trump campaign on the campaign trail. You have this language that exploits that radical agenda and associates it with this deregulatory paradigm, which is like super manipulative to people that maybe don't stay up to date on all of this stuff that much and don't have all the time to decipher all these things.
Or don't follow what people linked to Peter Thiel do and say. Yeah, interesting. Where they talk about both sides of their mouth. That's interesting. So I also think it's worth pointing out too that before we kind of wrap up the discussion on O'Neill here, a lot of his affiliation with Thiel, it's very extensive. We noted in the piece, but also, for a lot of his O'Neill's, after he was out of government and also no longer working for a Thiel affiliated VC, he was working for the SENS Research Foundation, which is devoted to treating longevity related or like age related diseases. It's basically, I would argue, one of those sort of Silicon Valley health quote unquote foundations that aims to offer life extension technologies. And a lot of big tech bros are kind of obsessed with this idea of immortality. Probably the most infamous of those is Brian Johnson, and he, along with Peter Thiel, have a significant interest in injecting young people's blood into themselves to stay young, for example. It's true. And the SENS Research Foundation is focused on, using biotech, including mRNA, DNA vaccines, and technology like that in order to allegedly extend people's lifespans. Which is the SENS Research Foundation is also, really exists thanks to the financing of Thiel as well. So it's no surprise that you have a lot of people affiliated with Thiel present there, like O'Neill, also Blake Masters, who's sort of like a J.D. Vance type of Thiel creation, whose failed political career was also bankrolled by Thiel. And he was on the SENS Research Foundation with O'Neill for some time. And they're focused on a lot of that kind of angle of biotech as well. And I think it's fair to sort of look, people need to pay attention to a lot of the Silicon Valley big tech and big pharma overlap. I've been covering it a lot since the COVID era. But basically there's been this effort, and you covered it in your piece about the WHO and permanent pandemic markets, this idea of the traditional income model for big pharma has basically run out of steam. It's been telegraphed openly by big pharma itself. They refer to it as the patent cliff issue. And so the way they want to get around patent cliffs, which is basically related to how products go generic and they don't make as much money when they're not exclusive products of that pharmaceutical company anymore. They've been going into biotech, and a lot of that is through joint ventures with big tech companies like Google, for example. And, you know, a lot of those companies also now double as major and essential parts of the national security state, and national security state contractors, and integral parts of the national security, mass surveillance apparatus. And so the idea of having a lot of this, this idea of selling biosurveillance and all of this is a way to improve, market response to healthcare products and all of this stuff, I would argue is really kind of a sly way to manufacture what I think is pretty openly acknowledged as the final frontier of mass surveillance, which is surveilling people's bodies through wearables and eventually through things inside the body, nanomedicines. And of course, I would put brain computer interfaces, BCIs like Neuralink, in that category. And I think it's important to remember too, with brain machine interfaces or BCIs, that it ultimately comes to the FDA to approve them. FDA tends to grant them breakthrough device status, which sort of waives some of the quote unquote regulatory red tape for these things. But we have, Elon Musk having a very prominent role in the government. Right now, he doesn't have to divest from any of his companies at all in that role, and neither does another PayPal mafia figure who's also now a special government employee, David Sachs, the crypto AI czar. And as crypto AI czar, it's very possible he could partner with someone like O'Neill, who is also a very big advocate for AI in healthcare, and see some of the stuff expanded as well. And I would definitely encourage people to pay attention to how this could potentially advance, because it has very Orwellian possibilities if they are collecting not just our data from our external activities and our external environment. There's this really crazy push to surveil everything and sort of mine all the data possible. You have companies tied to the current administration, for example, creating the Internet of Forests, trying to hook up every tree in the Amazon rainforest to mine biodata out of rainforest trees. It sounds bonkers, but there's ambitions to do that to people as well, and create the so-called Internet of Bodies, which military contractors and think tanks like the Rand Corporation have been writing about for years. And it's really not. I mean, I think Purdue or some other university like that recently created a whole center dedicated to accelerating the development of the Internet of Bodies. Silicon Valley has been pushing the wearable agenda for some time, and I think we could potentially see the push for that come through, under the guise of health. Initially it was like, look how cool Google glasses are, and look at my VR Apple helmet. And now I guess Facebook has made these like Ray-Ban looking ones that they think will not look as insane on people.
Yeah, my friend has a pair and they look completely stupid.
Yeah, you should break them for him. They'd do him a favor. Be like, hey, did you know Facebook started as a DARPA project? Can I borrow those for a second and take them to the garage? I don't know. Sorry. Getting a little too opinionated there. But anyway, this really is an ambition of that. And I think, when you have someone like Larry Ellison of Oracle, who was previously contracted to biosurveil COVID-19 vaccine recipients, coming out and saying we're going to have all these AI personalized cancer vaccines. They're going to be personalized. They're going to have to gather the testing data on you after you receive them. And they may not do the same method they did with COVID-19 with like blanket mandates, but it's very possible there will be some other type of coercive measure to try and get people to adopt this, because a big theme, whether it's healthcare or really anything else, like I mentioned earlier in reference to the SDGs, is about creating new markets that will make this oligarch class very wealthy and entrench their power, and sort of lead to this neo-feudalism in society. And I think this is one of those ways they could do that, because the only way they can get people to want these products is to create use public policy as the enabling environment for these markets, essentially. So it's kind of crazy, honestly, to see a lot of the mental gymnastics that have been used to sort of explain away the Stargate announcement, or Lutnick's comment about buying the U.S. government now buying equity in COVID-19 mRNA vaccine companies, or any of the other things we've discussed today. Even when our article came out on Jim O'Neill and his potential to undermine, a lot of these early Maha ambitions, pretty much crickets from a lot of the big influencers in that movement, which honestly, is kind of telling in itself as well. But also just a very little interest in addressing Palantir really at all. And Palantir, of course, is a company that has expanded under every administration. It's a bipartisan, it's the engine on which the quote unquote deep state runs. Yet no one in this administration or, its supporters really wants to talk about Palantir really very much at all. And how many investors in Palantir, O'Neill included, but also, people like Joe Lonsdale was a major donor to Trump. David Sachs is also an investor in Palantir. He's the crypto AI czar. And of course, Peter Thiel co-founded Palantir. And Palantir has numerous contracts with the U.S. military, and other, every 18 intelligence, all 18 of the U.S. intelligence agencies. Also very involved in Ukraine, which Kennedy was a big critic of, as well as the genocide in Gaza, which RFK, of course, is not a critic of. But nevertheless, Palantir has become kind of ubiquitous today. They also run a lot of the data for the British NHS, National Health Service, and they also run it for HHS, which I know you covered recently on your piece about the Palantir-run Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analysis at the CDC. And I think that's worth covering a little bit here too, as we try and wrap up here, to talk about sort of how, a new paradigm, if there's a new quote unquote public health emergency, how lockdowns or any of these other measures that became infamous during COVID might be implemented quote unquote more gently, as a way to make people think that, there's been an improvement over past, after post-COVID, when in reality a lot of these same tactics that are sort of
it's like this is sci-fi at this point. They have this thing called the Innovate branch. It's goal to create products to fake customers, including that line where it says in Flex H, that program that we mentioned earlier, to develop BioLRH website. That is what they call it. To measure kids are aiming to develop in an
okay, great.
Maybe even yeah, exactly, right. And it's
DNA through COVID vaccine testing, and Palantir took all of that data.
Right, and now they want to get more of it, I guess.
Generate data is potential to go Secretary of Connect surveillance company, Amazon, into basically like a token right now, which would be Trump's base, I think, but probably not exclusively Trump's base. I think there's plenty of things like mRNA is fine as long as press releases being like Neuralink, let's go. So I mean, it's very possible we can get through FDA.
The creation of and seems to be the strategy for the internet was first coming out. It was other places to develop this stuff. The student body that was radical and anti-war at the time.